Hello. The book is The Crusade Years, Herbert Hoover's Lost Memoir. The editor is George Nash, the most esteemed scholar of Herbert Hoover today. Herbert Hoover, he served from 1929 to 33, which means he was the president who saw the worst years of the Depression. And the Great Depression was so bad that a lot of our modern history is about assigning blame for it, figuring out whose fault that depression was. Many people blame Hoover, and down the decades, increasingly so. The 31st President of the United States was ranked 37 out of 43 in a recent U.S. News poll. That magazine wrote of Hoover, he was known as a poor communicator who fueled trade wars and exacerbated the Depression. So not only those on the left, but also sometimes on the right, assign blame to Herbert. And we're here today to talk about that specifically, and President Hoover's own analysis, his own work, which blames other people as well, including his successor, Franklin Roosevelt, and his predecessor, Calvin Coolidge. So we want to welcome you viewers to this Hoover revision. Dr. Nash is a frequent guest on this channel. Richard Norton Smith introduced him and interviewed him a few years ago for another book. And this time we're going to give license to this crucial, controversial Depression subject. We're going to break our hour into three parts. The first part is to remind ourselves who Hoover was. The second part is to talk about the production of this tremendous book and its many pages and much editing and detail. And the third part will be to talk about why it matters. What about the Great Depression? And today, C-SPAN viewers, welcome. George, welcome.
Thank you.
Hoover's identity really begins in college, and you've written a whole book about that. Where did Hoover go to college, and how did it affect him?
Yes, he was, first of all, born in 1874 in Iowa as the son of Quakers and son of a blacksmith, and he was orphaned before he was 10. Went out to live eventually with an uncle in Oregon, never had more than a middle school education, really, and then applied for entrance into newly formed Stanford University in the summer of 1891 and got admission and was told to take some additional tutoring with the help of which he passed most of his entrance exams and he was allowed to enter. He was probably literally the first student at Stanford University in the fall of 91, getting his dormitory room ahead of anyone else. And that became his, in a deep sense, his alma mater. You have to remember he's an orphan boy and he was trying to make it in the world. He was only 17 when he entered college, and he was rather shy, but he blossomed in college and became student body treasurer by the time he was out of college. And Stanford meant so much to him that about 25 years or so after that, after World War I, Hoover literally built his own home on the Stanford campus. And that's still there. It's the official residence today of the president of the university.
And Dr. Nash, what did he do with his education that he got there? He studied engineering, mining engineering.
Yes, his official major was geology, and he had an interest in mining engineering, and that quickly became his career after he graduated in the class of 1895. After a year or two in the United States, he got a break and was hired by a British mining engineering firm that was preeminent in the world at the time. And he was sent as a very young man to Australia. And before he left Australia at the age of 23, he was already manager of one of the great gold mines of the Australian gold rush, Sons of Gwalia, it was called. And from there, he went to, got married to a Stanford woman, who also was a geology major, possibly the first such woman in the United States to have that major. We can't be sure, but she was certainly a pioneer in her own right, Lou Henry Hoover. And they went to China for a couple of years in the mining world, and eventually Hoover used London as his base during his mining engineering career, which took him up to World War I. He became very successful at it, traveled all over the world, lived in places like Burma, China, Australia, and so forth, and had a great success at that first career.
So we want to stop a minute and think about this. Imagine you have a son or a daughter, and he goes to college and studies that thing the world needs most. At that point, getting minerals out of the ground. A growing economy needs minerals, especially when the world is on a gold standard, and your child is the best educated, this would be Hoover, in that area. He studied with masters at Stanford and is also the most able. So Hoover was, it was said, the best paid young man of his generation, and certainly one of the most successful. He wasn't just any success.
No, you're quite right. He became the outstanding mining engineer of his time. He was recognized for that. He was earning in 1908 to 1914 money probably in excess of $100,000 a year, which was a lot of money in those pre-income tax days. But you know, he didn't want to stop there. By the time he was 40, was probably a millionaire, a modest millionaire, not a Midas or a Rockefeller or a Mellon perhaps, but he wanted to do more with his life. He said just making money isn't enough. Having done well in his profession, he wanted to do something more creative, perhaps give back, and by a chain of circumstances that led to his second career as a humanitarian.
That's right, and Professor Nash has written about each stage of this early life. So he moved first in wartime to getting Americans back to the U.S. in World War I, then to a great rescue and feeding of the people of Belgium, and then to be also food administrator. Is that not right? That was sort of the beginning of American politics.
Yes, yes. Hoover was in London when the First World War broke out in the month of his 40th birthday, and he already had these notions he was going to return to the United States and get into public life in some vague way, probably by buying a newspaper. I think he thought he would become a newspaper owner. But at any rate, circumstances turned his life in a different direction, and as you just pointed out, he first helped American tourists who were stranded in Europe get home, and then was asked to organize what was thought would be a temporary emergency relief mission to help the distressed people of Belgium who had just been overrun by the German army at the start of the war. They didn't have enough food. And that turned into something that was without precedent in the history of humanity, feeding an entire occupied nation, several million people, almost over 9 million people if you count the couple million in northern France who fell into that sphere. That made Hoover an international hero and a symbol of a new force in the world at that time, American benevolence. Here was the new world coming to help the old in its tribulations. Hoover was doing this not by conducting war, but by dealing with the problem of war as a humanitarian. That made him, as I say, an international hero. It made him an American hero as well, and he entered the Wilson administration when we entered the war and became food administrator. Now he's kind of a world authority on food and food relief, a new field, humanitarian relief. Earned himself the accolade of the great humanitarian. He was called the Master of Emergencies, the Napoleon of Mercy. And at the end of the war, he went back on Wilson's instructions to organize relief to prostrate Europe. Many countries, over 20 countries, received food assistance that Hoover orchestrated and facilitated. And truly tens of millions of people were dependent on Hoover relief.
At that time, he had the opportunity to form some opinions about the revolutions that were going on in Europe,
yes,
whether it was Germany or Russia. Tell us a little bit about Russia, because he had investments there and he saw what happened with the Russian Revolution.
Yes. Hoover, as an American, traveled all over the world 5 times before World War I, and he was a very perceptive observer, and he was constantly comparing the America that he knew with these other social systems, and many of which were failing. And as you mentioned, there was great turmoil in the aftermath of World War I, and the communists had taken over Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and Hoover had basically pulled out of Russian mining interests before the revolution, but he lost a prospective fortune when the communists came in, seized the mines, and general chaos ensued. And he saw, and that was one of the great lessons he drew from that wartime and post-war experience, he saw what he regarded as the failure of command and control economies, as we would say. He used the word socialism, Bolshevism, and so forth, especially in Russia. And he saw that as a great failure, but also as a great challenge philosophically to the American way of doing things. So after his humanitarian episode, which probably resulted in his saving more lives than any person who's ever lived. That's been said of him, a remarkable achievement. After that, he returned to the United States in 1919 and entered American public life.
And that's right, and we're going to move through his career very quickly just to brief the reader to, so that we can get listeners